Today on The State of Us, the power of trust, how companies build it, lose it, and regain it. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by our friendly redneck liberal, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Why does trust matter for companies, and could the issue of trust hold many of the answers to what might be next for our raucous and divided country? Lance, who is our guest today?
Our guest is Sandra J. Sucher, a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School and an internationally recognized researcher who studies how organizations become trusted and the vital role that leaders play in the process. She was a business executive for 20 years before joining the Harvard faculty. She is also the author of a new book, The Power of Trust: How Companies Build It, Lose It, Regain It. Sandra, thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks so much, Lance, and hi to Justin.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on, and we'll get right into it. So, Sandra, your book covers a pretty challenging topic. I mean, trust, no less, right? So, especially in today's news and political landscape, who is the book ultimately intended for, and what do you hope that people are going to learn from it? How important is trust in our interactions with business?
The audience for this book is leaders and members of organizations who want to understand how to manage trust. So my goal is to take an important but kind of mushy concept and give it a spine, turn it into something that you can do something about. So here's a quote: virtually every economic transaction has within it an element of trust. And now that's not me. That's actually the Nobel Prize-winning economist Kenneth Arrow. And so we know that trust is really important in business, but let me back that up with just a couple of really quick data points to reinforce the importance of trust in interactions. So there was a study of NCAA basketball teams. There are 30 teams in the study, and what the researchers found was that the team with the most trust in its coach won the most games and actually won the championship, and the team with the least amount of trust won just 10% of its games. Trust in the coach turned out to be even more important than trust in my fellow players. So there's definitely a strategic advantage to trust. And then you can translate that into kind of a revenue advantage as well. So there was a study of 6,500 employees at Holiday Inns in Canada and the US, and they were testing for a number of different dimensions of managerial effectiveness. And what they found in this study was that it was on a scale of 1 to 5, that an 1/8 of a point increase in trust in the manager of the hotel yielded and corresponded with a $250,000 increase in revenue. It was the only dimension of management and leadership that had that revenue effect. So if you're interested in doing better in your business, it really does pay to pay attention to trust.
And just to be clear, you had mentioned this is for leaders and members of organizations. So it can be for the people leading the business, but really, even if you just work in a business, thinking about how trust plays into our interactions with clients or even our coworkers in our company are incredibly important, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So let me give you an example of the importance of everyone sort of paying attention to trust. And I'm going to quickly use an example of getting your COVID vaccination to help you understand a little bit about what trust is and how it works. So the definition of trust is a willingness to be vulnerable to the actions and intentions of others. And so when you think back to getting your COVID vaccination, you were hugely dependent and vulnerable to whether or not that vaccine was going to work, whether you've been told about any side effects that you might get. And so that's why trust is this willingness to be vulnerable. As a second dimension, this begins to show why it's important for everyone, is that trust is limited. So when you got that vaccine, you weren't counting on it doing anything else for you. except protecting you against COVID-19. In fact, the question we're all faced with now is, as these variants emerge, will these vaccinations that we've had protect us against them as well? So what that means is that trust is built and lost in individual interactions. The third example here is that trust is in the eye of the beholder. So if you think about the amazing and really at times quite painful discussion that we've had as a nation about whether these vaccines can be trusted, this shows that people trust for different reasons. And it's really important to make space in your mind for the fact that other people are going to trust differently the way that you do. And that helps you be open to the fact that trust is something that you can work on. But quite honestly, often it's going to be with people who don't necessarily share your point of view. And the last is a very important managerial lesson for anyone in an organization. And that what we've found is that trust is built from the inside out. So it's really pretty impossible to be trusted by people outside your organization if the people inside don't trust you. So if you think back to getting that COVID vaccine and how many hands that passed through from the person who developed it to the manufacturing process, distribution process, till it finally got to you, you hope that every single person on that chain actually felt pretty good about their employer. And were motivated to do their best. And they do that when they trust.
You've kind of gotten into it, but you explained in your book that you believe there are 4 components to trust. Is there any particular order that they need to be implemented? And is there any kind of time frame that you found out with your research to see if the effectiveness of building trust?
Let me use a slightly different example here to talk about the 4 dimensions. So, I said that trust is a willingness to be vulnerable. And reasonable people will then ask, well, on what basis? What makes me willing to be vulnerable? And what we found in our research is that there are 4 fundamental reasons why people trust. The first is competence. And so let's use Uber as an example. Uber created ride hailing as we know it. And the whole technology, human factor design that yields our ability to punch into a phone a location, know who's coming, get in the cab, get where we want to go. No money changes hands. We walk out and then we've had our transportation. Uber created all of that. And so competence is the foundation of trust. There's no reason to trust an organization or a business if it can't do what it's supposed to do. But in 2017, 500,000 people deleted their Uber accounts. So if competence were all that mattered in trust, Uber would own the market 100% and forever. But it doesn't, and that's because 3 other dimensions really matter. So competence is first. The next is motives. And people judge companies based on whose interests they see them serving. So there was a 2013 terrible accident in San Francisco where an Uber driver ran into a little girl and her family, killed the little girl, injured the mother and brother. The family took Uber to court, and in court, Uber claimed that at the time of the accident, the driver wasn't really an Uber driver because he hadn't yet accepted his next ride, and he didn't have an Uber passenger in the car. So if you ask yourself, well, whose interest does Uber care about? It's pretty clear at that moment that all that they cared about truly was Uber, certainly not the family, and not even its own driver. So that's what it means to sort of care about people's motives, whose interests they pursue. And then the next dimension is a question of means. This is really whether a company accomplishes its goals in a fair way. So in 1 year between 2013 and 2015, Uber management instructed its drivers to book and then cancel rides with Lyft, its main competitor. They did that 5,000 times during the course of a year. So this was an intentional campaign to disrupt the operations of your chief competitor. It defines unfairness. And so that's this third dimension of fair means. And then the last one is just the question of impact. What matters to us, in addition to competence and why you do what you do and how you go about doing it, is what's the actual effect of your actions. And so I'm briefly going to just talk about a woman in 2017, Susan Fowler, who wrote a blog post about her years at Uber. after she left, and she talked about sexual harassment there. And I'm not telling you about that, although you should look it up because it's a pretty awful story. Here's the data point that's important. When Susan Fowler started as a reliability engineer in her division, women were 25% of all the engineers. When she left, they were 3%. Now, Uber didn't set out to create an environment which made it hard for women to work and succeed, but it certainly had that effect. And so that's how we judge companies, not just on what they intend their impact to be, but on the actual impact they have. And all of this actually adds up to some pretty important consequences. So not being trusted matters. When Uber started in the business, it had roughly 90% of the market share. And in 2021, it ended up at about 68%.
We do start with competence, but then it's a process of building it because competence alone can't sustain it. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at coming up. So far, we've been talking about the 4 components of trust and why companies need it, but a number of questions still remain. How does fairness factor in to decisions at companies? And once an organization has made a mistake or a transgression, how can they fix it? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Today, we've been speaking with Sandra J. Sucher about her new book, The Power of Trust, How Companies Build It, Lose It, and Regain It. And at the end of the last segment, we talked some about the different components of trust, the 4 components really. And in the motive section of your book, Sandra, you say that companies have 3 major responsibilities. That's economic, legal, and ethical. Which of those seems to be the hardest and the easiest for companies to maintain, and why is that?
So here's the deal. Those 3 elements, they actually are meant to work together. So if you picture like one of those Venn diagrams of overlapping circles, all companies actually make decisions, and the goal is to make decisions which are simultaneously economically, legally, and ethically sound. So let me give you an example of that. Honeywell, during the Great Recession, used furloughs rather than layoffs. And this was a great example of fulfilling all 3 of these responsibilities. Economically, they matched the furloughs to business conditions. So depending on which division you were in at Honeywell, you would have a 1-week furlough unpaid leave, or you would have a 5-week one. And so economically, it made sense for the business. Legally, they had to manage this at the time. There were really very differing legal regimes under which each state managed furloughs, and it had to do that successfully under all 3. And ethically, this is where this really paid off. So Dave Cote, who was the CEO at the time, he knew that furloughs were going to be better in the long run for investors. Because what he knew was that coming out of the recession, they would need to have an intact workforce that was trained and able to make good on the commitments that they had for new products for customers. And he thought that furloughs actually was a much better way to achieve that goal. And so that was being ethically fair. He also, by the way, took no bonus himself that year, nor did any members of his direct reports. And they did that not because that was the difference between life and death for them, but because it just didn't seem fair for them to take a bonus at a time when other people were losing their paychecks. So that's an example of how it is that you can be simultaneously economically, legally, and ethically fair and sound in your business decisions. And therefore, you can be trusted.
Fairness is talked about constantly in our society. And in Chapter 4, you explain that there are different types of fairness. How and why is fairness so important to that concept of trust? And how does the phrase, life isn't fair, fit into this concept?
We are built to care about fairness. So infants as young as 12 months expect resources to be divided equally between two characters in a scene that they watch. By preschool, children will protest getting less than peers. They'll even pay to prevent a peer from getting more. And as they get older, they're willing to punish those who've been unfair, both when they're the victims and when they've simply been a bystander. So we are born with a sense of fairness, and it is part of the reasons why how we go about doing business makes so much of a difference. So I was reading an article the other day about the fact that one of the major banks has decided to discontinue late fees for checks. And what they did was they had a study where they showed that the proportion of people who actually suffered from having late fees imposed on them were the people who had the hardest time paying their bills, and those are poor people. And they said, you know what, this is fundamentally unfair. So we're going to stop this practice. And I guarantee you that that will earn them trust with their customers and with their employees, who probably didn't feel particularly great about imposing these fees on people who had almost no money in their bank account to begin with. So fairness really matters. And as to your question about life is fair or life isn't fair, so I don't know if you've watched Squid Games. This is international, right? And I'm a huge fan of K-drama in general. And I was actually getting my nails done and was talking about it with the person who does my nails, because she's Vietnamese. She watches these shows as well. And so the woman next to me said, well, her son was watching Squid Game. So what's it about? And I said, well, essentially it's about rich people taking advantage of poor people. And she said, oh, like life. So this question of fairness, this is something that we know, but it's a context that we live in, but it's not an excuse for behaving in an unfair way ourselves. I just want to make that perfectly clear. And that's why the companies that know how to be fair and decide to become more fair actually are more trusted.
Well, I'm sure to people listening, they're starting to think, it sounds like there's a lot of stuff that goes into trust. I'm not sure how easy this is to do. I'm not sure that we can do this and never make a mistake. But part of your book is about redemption, right? Everyone makes mistakes, especially companies. And when an organization has been unfair or it violates trust in some other way, your book tells us there is a path back. So how should a person or company apologize effectively?
Yeah, so everybody listen up here, because this can be used at home, right? So here's a 3-step process for apologizing that will be more successful than whatever it is that you've been doing so far. The first step is that you have to acknowledge harm and say you're sorry. So research has found that the first thing that people want to hear from you is that you knew that you created harm for them and that you're sincerely sorry that you did that. And that language really matters. The second step is an explanation of how that trust breach occurred. And because people care about, well, how did you actually end up doing that thing? And then the third step is what's called an offer of repair. So this is what you will do to make things right. So I don't know if you recall, in 2017, the PricewaterhouseCoopers allowed the wrong winner for Best Picture to be announced at the Oscars. So La La Land was announced. It should have been Moonlight. And they had a picture-perfect apology up on their website literally that night. And it said, we're so sorry that this happened. They complimented the grace with which the people who were the real winners had accepted what had happened and moved on. And then they explained that what had happened, and this was very painful, was that one of the people on the stage had been on his cell phone and hadn't noticed that the wrong card was given. So the offer of repair that they made, and they did this over time, was first obviously to ban cell phones from all the people who were working at the Oscars. But the more important was that everyone who worked the Oscars had to memorize all the winners. And what that meant was that everyone could immediately recognize if a mistake has been made. So that's what it means to repair trust. It's not just that you care that you're sorry, that you can explain what happened. You actually have to do something to guarantee that it won't, or ensure as much as you can that that same breach of trust won't happen again.
If you could pick 2 or 3 of the most important qualities or decisions that leaders need to make to be trusted by all their stakeholders, and not just their shareholders, what would it be?
So the first would be that just to think about trust as vulnerability. So it's other people's judgment of you is what actually matters. Usually we think about ourselves, not wrongly, but when you're working on trust, it's really the view of the other person that you have to take into account. The second is that trust is not just one thing. As we saw with Uber, it's not just competence, it's your motives and your means and your impact. And the last, if you'll let me one more, is just this notion that lost trust can be recovered. So it's pretty inspiring to know that it's not game over if you've done something wrong and that you can build it back, as we just saw in that example. So it's your commitment to serving other people's interests as well as your own is what helps you deserve trust over time.
And I think the key is, as you point out, it's how you handle it, correct? I mean, if you're trying to repair the damage, I remember the anecdote that you used about the oil representative with the oil coming up into Louisiana. And I was just flabbergasted when you shared his response to the oil spill and the damage it was doing. But it was just basically, yeah, my life's really been disrupted and hurt by this, or something to that effect, right?
This was the BP spill. And what this guy, Tony Hayward, said at the time is, no one feels this more keenly than I do. I can't wait to get my life back.
I mean, amazing, right?
Yeah. Bit of a boondoggle there.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so offensive when someone says something as ridiculous as that. And quite honestly, I was glad that he lost his job. That's fundamental malpractice from a CEO.
Well, and it goes back to proving that, which you spoke about earlier, which is this need for even bystanders who really don't have, any immediate connection to the issue, will want to see people that they perceive as being unfair or having breached trust in some way punished for having done that. And that's part of why I'd imagine that when you talk about the components of an effective apology, that last component is so critical. I mean, it's great to say that we're sorry. It's great to explain why it happened, but those things are really only as good as, what am I going to do to make sure that it doesn't happen again?
Absolutely right. And it's a very good example of how it's really the impact that matters, right? When we're thinking about trust, it's what effect has your actions had on me? And what are you going to do to make sure that you have a better effect on me in the future?
You mentioned Squid Games, and I was talking to Lance about it the other day, saying, you got to watch this because it plays on some interesting components. But there was another piece on Netflix that I just watched actually while finishing reading your book, from their, explained series, like The Mind Explained and these other things. They're very catchy, and they're in partnership with Vox Media, I believe. And they had one on apologies. And it was fascinating because basically those three components, along with 4 or 5 others, they talked about effective apologies. Why are we bad as people at making effective apologies? And they talked about that fine line between explaining why something happened and being defensive.
Right. Yeah. So the classic bad guidance here is a statement that reads something like, mistakes were made. Right. So the first question was, well, who made those mistakes and what happened? I think the trick for anyone trying to do this is to objectively describe, without any color, what it is that occurred. So if you can do that, so PricewaterhouseCoopers, someone was on their cell phone and let the wrong card go past. That's a description of what happened. It's not an apology per se. It just simply says, here is how this thing occurred. And that's how you keep the defensiveness out of it. So when we start defending, we build our own justification into something. Well, I didn't mean for it to happen. That person was a jerk. None of that matters. It's really what occurred. And that's how you keep it from sounding defensive.
We all have that desire to understand things. And I'd imagine that's part of why it's an important component of an apology, is not so much, to your point, well, I didn't want it to happen, or I didn't, it's like, well, none of that really is what we're thinking about. It's, well, how could you have announced the wrong award winner? I mean, this is, such a huge professional production. How possibly could that take place? How did somebody not figure this out? And so it satisfies some of that, curiosity of human error. human distraction. But at the same time does not get into the realm of, well, we try, really hard with our people to do everything right. And this person's just an idiot. And, and they didn't do any of that. And that's probably part of why it was effective. So
exactly.
How can we use what we've learned today from Sandra in our modern society, and how might those observations better inform our conversations about today's leaders? Well, that's exactly what Lance and I are going to discuss in the next segment of the show. Sandra, we really appreciate you taking some time to speak with Lance and me.
Thank you so much. It was a really great conversation. I appreciate it.
Highly recommend that everybody out there take an opportunity to pick up a copy of her new book. It's The Power of Trust: How Companies Build It, Lose It, and Regain It. You can do so by going to thestateofus.org or just find it anywhere that books are found. What do Lance and I think about the case Sandra has made, and what does the future hold for our nation and trust? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Today, we've been speaking with Sandra J. Sucher about her new book, The Power of Trust: How Companies Build It, Lose It, and Regain It. And there was a lot of stuff that we didn't get to cover, obviously, from the book in today's episode, but I think we got a good foundation for it, Lance. Specifically, though, there was a thing that we didn't get to talk about at all that really hit home for you, and that's a particular paradox, right?
The creator, Jerry Harvey, a professor of management science at George Washington University, introduced something he called the Abilene paradox to the world in 1974. The story goes on a hot July day in Texas, and there were two couples involved, and they decided they wanted to go out to dinner. And the one gentleman said, well, let's drive 53 miles into Abilene. And, a car doesn't have any air conditioning, but it'd be a great place to have dinner. And his wife says that would be a great idea, and the mother-in-law agrees. And so everyone piles into the car. They drive 53 miles in 104-degree temperature with no air conditioning and enjoy a subpar dinner. When they returned, Harvey said, hey, did everybody like the trip? And the mother-in-law confesses, well, I didn't really want to go, but I agreed to just because everyone else seemed enthusiastic. And the wife admits she thought it was a crazy idea, but she wanted to keep everyone happy. And the gentleman who thought of the idea said, well, I would have rather just stayed home, but I brought it up just in case anybody wanted to go. Oh my gosh, does that sound like my house? The Abilene effect for a family trip is painful, but as Sandra says, it's multiplied across an organization, and it can cause enormous amounts of human misery and economic loss. So the boss says something, everybody goes along with it, and nobody speaks up and says, did you think that this might not work? And it opens up a whole can of worms for your business.
And it speaks to trust, I think, because often when we talk about, we don't just want yes people. That's true, but it also puts all of the onus on the worker to say, well, you need to speak up, right? It's your job to speak up. But I think it's also important that we ask, have we fostered an environment where people feel okay speaking up? There's a lot of people, as we know and have talked about, who they may think that, and they might even be willing to explain it if they were asked. But if they feel like if I say something, I might get fired or demoted or, then they may not say something simply because, in other words, they're not necessarily a yes person. They're just getting the yes because it's like, well, my job's more important to me than being right on this or pointing out the issue.
Because as the manager or the owner, you haven't created the climate where people feel comfortable disagreeing with what you've said and not come back at them and say, well, why didn't anybody say anything?
Right.
Well, because exactly
we were afraid of
that tone that you just used with us about not saying anything is what you do when we bring up a what if, or did you think about this? Or maybe it would be better if we do this. Every time we do that, you snap at us and then you call us into the office and you smack our hands and you tell us, you need to quit embarrassing me in the meetings because you're making me look bad to my bosses.
Because there might be bosses out there saying, well, yeah, but I know I got these, I got 2 or 3 snarky employees that if I do that, they're not really interested in making anything better. They're just going to be the ones sitting there, having fun, trying to poke at everything and delaying us from making a decision. Okay, but then maybe they shouldn't be on the team, right? Because that's speaking to our motives component of we're not engaging with honest intention. If a person's honest intention in bringing up a potential issue with something is truly because they don't want the issue to occur, that's very different than somebody who's just being a problem, And the issue is that often we, as managers or bosses, we make decisions to avoid, just like all humans, the conflict, right? So rather than say, we need to have an open discussion. If you have an issue with something that I've said, let's talk about it. Well, I'm afraid that there's going to be people that are just snarky and, are a pain and that will never get anything done. So I'm just not going to do it at all. Well, that's not good either. We need to address the people that are the issues, which, as we've talked about, is harder to do than just making the blanket of, I just don't want any input because it's easier that way. Well, it might be easier, but that doesn't make it better. And in the long run, I think, as the book points out, it's really not easier. It might be easier that day, but then what happens in the long run is that costly mistakes are made that lose the business money that you have to apologize to the public at large for. And I'm really not sure that's worth the little bit of easy that you get, in your meeting by not allowing for some conversation,
Well, I think it's very interesting. She mentions a company in the book, and we'll do a spoiler alert. You have to pick up a copy of the book and read it, where the new employees are brought to a spiral staircase with employees on both sides, from ownership to the lowliest of workers, I guess. And I don't want to say that lowly, but to the people who aren't making as much money. And they are paraded through and they're clapped and glad-handed all the way and welcomed into the company because you are a vital part of this. I mean, when I read that, I'm like, man, that's never happened to me before. I got a handshake, said, okay, here's your time card, go to work. But everybody stops and recognizes you. And the company goes so far as, even if they don't hire you, they send you out with an expensive box of candy and say, thank you for your time. We really appreciate you applying for a job here. You're just not what we need right now, but we appreciate your time and your efforts. And they send you away with a gift as they've turned you down for a job. I mean, talking about creating an atmosphere where you want to work for that company and where you want to do everything right, sounds to me like they're doing it the right way. So read the book and get some ideas. And you won't be amazed when you read about it. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. I've heard that about that place, and the reason why they have such a good reputation for being honest and fair and doing good things is because that's the way they treat anybody who applies for a job with their company, not just the people who get it.
Yeah, I think when our minds go to trust and businesses, and probably even when some of you were reading the title of this show, the immediate thing that came to mind was, why do I need to trust the company I'm going to do business with? Which is absolutely part of this conversation, but it also has to do with, who do you work for and do you trust them? And I thought that the descriptor of trust, the willingness to be vulnerable to others, is very powerful, because I'm not sure how many of us really understand trust. And it is, in fairness, as hopefully today's episode has again outlined, understanding it, takes a little bit of work, because it's not just one thing. If you were going to boil it down, it's the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions and intentions of other people. And as a society, just as human beings in general, being vulnerable for most people is not a big strong suit. So trust, therefore, it makes sense, is tricky to gain it and to keep it. And if you lose it, to get it back. None of those things are idle, passive activities, right? Think about the people you trust in your life. Why do you trust them? Well, let's say just that you trust your mom, right? Well, why do you trust her? Well, she's always been there for me. When I need help, she helps me, and she doesn't necessarily expect anything in return. And I don't know if that's true of your mother or not. I'm just saying, okay, well, what did we just establish there? A track record of always being willing to help, always caring about you, right? And always having your best intentions at heart. So what's not to trust? But again, that's been built over time through multiple actions, through ongoing proof that that trust is worth having. And I think that we assume, and Sandra points this out, Lance, that as a company, it's about who we are and what we do. And really, that's a component, but it has a lot more to do with what does somebody need from us in order to trust us, right? What are they thinking? And the word I wrote down and underlined when she was talking was empathy. We talk about that a lot, right? As a company, if we want other people's trust, we have to try to put ourselves in their shoes and say, what do they need to trust us, right? What do they need? Not what do I do? What do they need from me to trust me? Because if we're approaching it the other way around, what can I do to make them trust me? Well, what you can do is figure out what they need in order to trust you. And that may seem like a semantics thing, but I think it's really important. I mean, we only spoke about it briefly with her, but I think it's huge to the mindset you have to go into it with. And sometimes ask people. I mean, there were several examples in the book where they asked their employees, right? The Michelin thing. Michelin has this huge debacle. They handled layoffs terribly. So then the way they fixed it was they created these groups, right, of employees and community people. And they said, okay, if layoffs are going to happen, one of two things. You either need to help us figure out how to do it responsibly, right? Give us your input, or you need to show us a plan that gets you to sustainability, profitability.
Well, that was the key. They didn't just create a group and then let them talk and give input. They actually empowered them to make,
because they did what the recommendations
make the decision.
Were.
Right.
They said, well, yeah, okay, we're going to try that.
I've been a part of many of those input groups where everything's just thrown in a trash can or somebody's desk and it's never implemented. And very quickly, the workers said, yeah, these are stupid. And so we all just put in our time. But the key component there is when you empower your employees to make that decision. Like you said, okay, you come up with the plan so that you can all keep your job. Okay, there you go. You did it. You did the work. We're going to implement it. Hey, it worked. Everybody keeps their job. That's when they trust you, is when you actually empower them and not just ask for their input.
So Lance, why did we have this conversation about trust today? I think our mission says something, vaguely, right? About, okay.
It does something about that, but the biggest thing is we're so glad that you trusted us and listened to today's episode, and hopefully you learned some things, because we know we did when we read the book. But our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations, which you can put the word trust in there anywhere you want. And if you've enjoyed today's show and you share it with people where you work, or you're the boss and you share it with your employees, and they say, well, where'd you get these great ideas? Tell them you were listening to an episode of The State of Us. And they go, well, where can we find that show? Tell them as a podcast, we're on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is released as a podcast Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning, and on the weekends on radio stations across the country. So check your local AM or FM talk radio station. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.